He thought turning her away would be routine, just another quiet dismissal in a place built for appearances, but in less than 10 minutes, that single decision would unravel everything he believed about power and status. The restaurant glowed under soft golden chandeliers, every table dressed in crisp white linen, crystal glasses catching the light like tiny stars as conversations hummed in low, polished tones, the kind of place where a single entree could cost more than a week's paycheck, and where every detail, from the polished marble floors to the tailored suits of its guests, whispered exclusivity. And then Evelyn Carter walked in. Her uniform was simple, a faded gray janitor's outfit with a name patch slightly worn at the edges, her sneakers clean but clearly used, the quiet echo of her steps drawing more attention than she intended as heads began to turn, one by one, subtle at first, then unmistakable. A hostess behind the podium paused mid-greeting, her smile tightening just enough to reveal hesitation, her eyes scanning Evelyn from head to toe, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing, but finding none. For a brief second, the room held its breath, not in shock, but in quiet judgment, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. Evelyn didn't rush, didn't shrink, didn't adjust her posture to fit the room around her. She simply walked forward with steady calm, her gaze level, as if she had every right to be there, as if the polished floors belonged beneath her feet just as much as anyone else's. The hostess cleared her throat, forcing professionalism back into her voice, though the uncertainty lingered beneath it. "Can I help you?" Evelyn offered a small, polite nod, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, I have a reservation." The words seemed to ripple through the air, unexpected, almost misplaced, and for a moment, the hostess hesitated again, her fingers hovering over the reservation book, unsure whether to take the statement seriously or dismiss it altogether. Before she could respond, a sharper voice cut through the moment, confident, practiced, and unmistakably authoritative. "Mark Reynolds." The manager approached with the ease of someone who controlled the room without effort, his tailored suit perfectly fitted, his expression composed, but his eyes already carrying a decision before a single word was spoken. He stopped just close enough to assert presence, his gaze flicking over Evelyn in a single, assessing glance that lasted no more than a second but said everything. Around them, conversation slowed, curiosity pulling attention toward the unfolding scene as a few nearby guests subtly leaned back in their chairs, pretending not to watch while clearly doing exactly that. Mark's smile was polite, but it never reached his eyes. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, his tone measured, careful, designed to sound reasonable while leaving no room for argument. Evelyn didn't move, didn't react. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, her posture steady, her eyes meeting his without challenge, but without submission either. "I have a reservation," she repeated, the same calm certainty in her voice, unchanged, unshaken. Something in the air shifted then, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when everything grows just a little too quiet. Mark exhaled softly, as if inconvenienced, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the impatience beneath the professionalism. He glanced briefly toward the hostess, then back at Evelyn, lowering his voice slightly, though not enough to keep the nearby tables from hearing. "This establishment maintains a certain standard," he said, each word carefully chosen, each syllable carrying weight. "And I'm afraid we can't accommodate." He paused, letting his gaze drift deliberately over her uniform again. "This situation." The room didn't erupt, didn't gasp, didn't react loudly, but the silence that followed was heavier than any sound, a quiet confirmation of what had just been implied. Evelyn stood there, unchanged, her expression unreadable, as if his words hadn't landed the way he expected them to, as if the judgment hanging in the air had no power over her at all. And in that stillness, something began to feel off, though no one could quite explain why. Mark Reynolds had delivered lines like that 100 times before, always with the same outcome, a quiet apology, a lowered gaze, a retreat toward the door, but this time something did not follow the script, because Evelyn Carter did not move. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as nearby diners exchanged quick glances, some pretending to return to their meals, while their attention stayed locked on the woman standing at the center of the room, her presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Mark shifted his weight slightly, just enough to reveal that his patience was thinning, his voice tightening as he added, "I am going to have to ask you to leave." It was no longer a suggestion. It was a command wrapped in politeness. A server passing by slowed down, her tray hovering midair, eyes flicking between Evelyn and the manager, sensing that something about this moment was different, though she could not yet explain why. Evelyn inhaled quietly, not as someone preparing to argue, but as someone deciding something far more deliberate. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and almost disarmingly simple. "Before I do that," she said, "could you please check the reservation under Carter?" The name hung in the air, ordinary at first glance, easy to dismiss. Yet something in the way she said it made the hostess glance down at the screen almost instinctively, fingers hesitating above the keyboard, as if unsure whether she should even be doing this. Mark let out a short, controlled breath, a hint of irritation slipping through his composed exterior. "That will not be necessary," he replied quickly, stepping slightly between Evelyn and the podium, subtly blocking access as though the very act of checking would somehow validate her presence. A quiet murmur rippled through the nearest tables, not loud enough to disrupt the atmosphere, but enough to signal that the audience was growing, that the moment was no longer private. Evelyn's eyes remained on Mark, unwavering, not confrontational, but impossibly steady, as if she was seeing something he was not. "Are you sure," she asked softly, "that you want to make that decision without verifying?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, the kind that did not rely on volume or aggression, but on certainty. For a brief second, something flickered across Mark's face, doubt perhaps, or the faint recognition that he might be stepping into something he did not fully understand, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by confidence sharpened by habit. "I am very sure," he said, his tone firm now, leaving no room for discussion. He turned his head slightly, signaling toward the entrance where a security guard had begun to move closer, slow and measured, not yet intervening, but ready if needed. The shift did not go unnoticed. A couple seated near the window leaned closer together, whispering under their breath, while another guest set down his fork entirely, his attention no longer even pretending to be elsewhere. The room had changed. What began as a quiet dismissal was becoming something else, something heavier, something that carried consequence. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the approaching guard, then back to Mark, her expression unchanged, her composure intact in a way that did not match the situation he believed he was controlling. She reached into her pocket slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not defensive, as if time itself had slowed around her, and pulled out her phone. The small movement drew every eye in the room, subtle yet magnetic, as if everyone sensed that whatever came next would matter. Mark watched her closely now, his confidence beginning to tighten at the edges, though he did not step back, did not soften, still anchored in the belief that he was the one setting the terms of this interaction. Evelyn looked down at the screen for just a moment, then lifted her gaze back to him, her voice quiet, but clear enough to cut through the tension. "I just want to be clear," she said. "You are refusing service to a guest with a confirmed reservation, without checking your system, correct?" The phrasing was precise, almost formal, and it landed differently than anything she had said before, not like a complaint, not like a plea, but like a statement being recorded. Mark hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for the balance of the moment to begin to shift in a way he could not yet see. "Yes," he answered finally, his voice firm again, though now carrying a subtle edge of defensiveness. "That is correct." And in that instant, something invisible settled into place, like a decision locking in, like a door closing somewhere behind him that he did not even realize he had walked through. The moment Mark Reynolds said those words out loud, something in the room shifted in a way no one could quite name, as if an invisible line had been crossed, and everyone present could feel it, even if they did not understand why. Evelyn Carter held his gaze for a second longer, not challenging him, not reacting with anger or embarrassment, but with a quiet certainty that made the silence feel heavier than before, as though the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere beyond the reach of anyone in that room. The security guard slowed his steps, no longer as confident as before, his posture subtly uncertain as he glanced between Mark and Evelyn. sensing that this situation was not unfolding the way it usually did. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly to her phone, her thumb moving once across the screen, deliberate and calm, before she returned her attention to Mark, her voice still even, still composed. "Thank you for clarifying," she said, the words simple, but carrying a finality that did not match the situation he believed he controlled. Mark frowned slightly, the smallest crack appearing in his confidence, as if he had expected resistance, maybe even emotion, but not this quiet acceptance that felt strangely out of place. Around them, the restaurant had fallen into near complete silence, the soft background music now barely noticeable, replaced by the subtle sounds of shifting chairs and held breaths as more guests turned fully to watch, no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. A woman near the center of the room set down her wine glass without taking a sip, her attention fixed entirely on Evelyn, while a man at a nearby table leaned back, folding his arms as if settling in to witness something he did not yet understand but could not look away from. Evelyn slipped her phone back into her pocket with the same measured calm, then took a single step back, not toward the exit, but just enough to create space, as if she were no longer part of the confrontation, but instead observing it from a distance. "I appreciate your time," she said softly, her tone polite, almost courteous, as though nothing unusual had occurred, as though she had not just been publicly dismissed in front of an entire room. The words confused Mark more than any argument would have, his brows drawing together as he searched her face for some sign of defeat, some indication that he had asserted control, but found none. Instead, there was only that same steady calm, that same unshaken presence that refused to align with the narrative he had already decided. The hostess, still standing behind the podium, hesitated again, her eyes flicking down to the reservation screen one more time, her fingers twitching slightly, as if she wanted to check the name that had been spoken, Carter, but did not dare to act without permission. The hesitation lingered just long, enough to be noticed. Mark turned slightly toward her, catching the movement, his expression tightening as he gave a subtle shake of his head, a silent command to stand down, to trust his judgment, to maintain the standard he believed he was protecting. But that moment, small as it was, did not go unnoticed by Evelyn. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the screen, just a flicker, just enough to confirm something only she understood, before returning to Mark with that same composed stillness. And then, from somewhere near the entrance, a sound broke through the tension, not loud, not dramatic, but distinct enough to ripple across the room, the soft opening of the main doors followed by the measured steps of someone entering with purpose. Conversations did not resume. No one turned away. If anything, the silence deepened, anticipation settling over the room like a quiet storm about to break. The security guard paused completely now, no longer moving forward, his attention drawn toward the entrance, while several guests instinctively shifted in their seats to see who had just arrived. Mark, still facing Evelyn, had not yet turned, still anchored in the moment he believed he controlled, unaware that the situation had already begun to move beyond him. And Evelyn, standing there in her simple uniform, allowed the faintest hint of something to touch her expression, not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, but something closer to recognition, as if the next piece of the story had just stepped into place exactly when it was supposed to. The man who stepped through the entrance did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not demand attention. And yet the moment his polished shoes touched the marble floor, something in the atmosphere shifted so distinctly that even those who had been pretending not to watch now turned fully, drawn by a presence that carried quiet authority rather than spectacle. He was dressed simply but precisely, a dark tailored suit that spoke of intention rather than excess, his posture relaxed but deliberate, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if he already knew exactly where to look. Conversations did not resume. Glasses remained untouched. The soft clink of silverware had completely faded, replaced by a silence that now felt almost deliberate, as though the entire restaurant had paused to witness something none of them had anticipated. The hostess noticed him first, her expression changing in an instant, the uncertainty from moments before replaced by something sharper, more alert, as she straightened instinctively, her hands smoothing the edge of the podium, as if preparing for someone important. A server nearby adjusted her posture without realizing it, her shoulders pulling back, her movements suddenly more precise. Even the security guard, who had been moving toward Evelyn just seconds earlier, stopped entirely, his attention now fixed on the man approaching from the entrance. Mark Reynolds had not yet turned. He remained focused on Evelyn, still holding onto the authority of the moment he believed he controlled, his posture firm, his expression composed, unaware that the center of gravity in the room had already shifted behind him. Evelyn, however, had noticed. Of course she had. Her gaze moved briefly past Mark, just a flicker, just long enough to acknowledge the arrival, before returning to him with that same steady calm. Though now there was something else beneath it, something almost imperceptible, like a quiet confirmation that everything was unfolding exactly as expected. The man continued forward, his steps measured, unhurried, yet each one seemed to carry weight, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood by those who recognized it. As he moved deeper into the room, a subtle ripple followed him, small shifts in posture, glances exchanged between staff, a tightening of attention that spread without a single word being spoken. And then he stopped, not at the entrance, not at the hostess stand, but directly beside Evelyn Carter, close enough that there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no question about who he had come to stand next to. Mark finally turned. The movement was small, almost automatic, but the moment his eyes landed on the man, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be seen, enough to be felt. Recognition, confusion, and then something deeper, something slower, like a realization beginning to take shape but not yet fully understood. "Sir," Mark said quickly, adjusting his tone, the polished professionalism returning, though now carrying a trace of urgency beneath it. "I apologize for the disruption. We are handling a situation." The words sounded practiced, controlled, but they did not land the way he expected them to, because the man did not look at him. Not immediately. Instead, he looked at Evelyn. Not at her uniform, not at her appearance, but at her, fully, directly, with a level of respect that did not match the scene that had just unfolded. And then he spoke, his voice calm, clear, and carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables without effort. "Miss Carter," he said, a slight nod accompanying the name. "We have been expecting you." The words did not echo, but they did not need to. They settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything at once. The hostess's hand froze above the reservation screen. The server holding the tray went completely still. The security guard took a small step back without realizing it. And Mark Reynolds froze. Not completely, not obviously, but enough. Enough that the confidence he had held just moments ago no longer sat quite the same on his shoulders. Because in that single sentence, spoken without emphasis, without accusation, without explanation, the entire story had begun to rewrite itself, and for the first time, Mark was no longer certain where he stood within it. The name landed with a precision that left no room for interpretation, and for a brief moment, no one in the room seemed to breathe. Evelyn Carter did not react with surprise, did not turn abruptly, did not acknowledge the statement with anything more than a subtle shift in her gaze, as if the words spoken had simply confirmed something that had always been true. Mark Reynolds, however, felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to slip. His eyes moved quickly between the man beside her and Evelyn herself, searching for context, for some explanation that would restore the balance he had so confidently held just seconds before. I apologize," Mark began, his voice no longer as smooth, no longer as controlled. "There must be some confusion." The words came out too quickly, slightly uneven, betraying the first real crack in his composure. The man turned his attention to him then, not sharply, not aggressively, but with a calm focus that carried far more weight than any raised voice ever could. "Is there?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost curious, yet the question did not invite an answer so much as it exposed one. Around them, the staff had gone completely still, the hostess now staring at the reservation screen as if it held the answer. She had been afraid to check, her fingers trembling slightly before finally, slowly, she began typing. "Carter." The name appeared, and then everything else followed. Her eyes widened, just slightly, just enough to signal that whatever she was seeing did not match what had just happened. She looked up, then back at the screen, then at Evelyn again, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something closer to realization. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice directed at Mark but carrying through the silence. "The reservation, it is under Carter. Private table. 8 o'clock. The words dropped into the room like a final piece clicking into place. Mark's jaw tightened. For a moment, he said nothing, could say nothing, because the situation he had dismissed, the name he had refused to check, the guest he had chosen to remove, had been real all along. But the realization did not stop there. It deepened. The man beside Evelyn took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic entirely, his presence now unmistakably aligned with hers. "Not just any reservation," he continued calmly, his voice steady, "but the Carter reservation." The emphasis was subtle, but it carried meaning, the kind that did not need to be explained to be understood. A murmur moved through the room, low and uncertain, as guests began connecting pieces, glances exchanged, expressions changing as the weight of the moment settled in. Mark felt it. He felt every eye, every second stretching longer than it should. "I was not aware," he said, forcing the words out, attempting to recover, to regain control, but the authority he had relied on moments before no longer held the same weight. It sounded thinner now, less certain. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice unchanged, calm as ever, but now carrying a clarity that cut through everything else. "That is exactly the point," she said. No anger, no raised tone, just truth. And somehow, that made it heavier. The man beside her nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving Mark. "You made a decision," he said, "without checking, without asking, without even considering that you might be wrong." Each phrase landed cleanly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. The hostess lowered her eyes. The server with the tray shifted uncomfortably. Even the security guard took another small step back, distancing himself from a moment that no longer belonged to him. Mark opened his mouth again, but no immediate words came, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to justify, only the consequences of a choice made too quickly, too confidently, and without enough humility to question it. Evelyn looked around the room then, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet awareness of everything that had just unfolded, of every glance, every whisper, every silent judgment that had filled the space moments before. And when her eyes returned to Mark, there was no anger there, only something far more unsettling, understanding. And in that moment, the room did not erupt, did not react loudly, did not demand resolution. It simply held the silence, heavy and undeniable, as everyone present realized the same thing at once. The woman they had just watched being turned away had never been out of place at all. The silence did not break because no one knew how to move forward from what had just been revealed, and in that stillness, the weight of the moment settled deeper than any raised voice ever could. Mark Reynolds stood there, the confidence that had once defined his posture now replaced by something far more fragile, something uncertain, as if he were trying to piece together how a situation he believed he fully controlled had shifted so completely beyond him. His eyes moved again to Evelyn Carter, but this time there was no dismissal in his gaze, no quick judgment, only the growing realization that he had misunderstood everything from the very beginning. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, his tone adjusting, searching for footing, "if there has been any inconvenience, I assure you it was not intentional." The words sounded formal, practiced, but even he could hear the difference, the subtle strain beneath them, the recognition that intention was no longer the issue. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to remain, not as a tactic, but as a natural extension of the moment, giving space for what had already been exposed to fully exist. Around them, the restaurant remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer curiosity or quiet judgment. It was awareness, a collective understanding that something deeper than a simple mistake had just been revealed. The man beside her glanced briefly around the room, taking in the reactions, the lowered eyes of staff, the attentive stillness of guests, before returning his focus to Mark. "This was not about inconvenience," he said calmly, his voice steady. "This was about assumption." The word lingered, simple but exact, cutting through any attempt to soften what had happened. Mark swallowed, his throat tightening slightly as he tried to respond, but the usual language of explanation did not seem to fit here. Because this was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, and everyone in the room now understood that. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quiet, composed, but carrying clearly across the space. "You saw my uniform," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement, "and you decided who I was." There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just clarity. And somehow, that made it impossible to dismiss. The hostess lowered her gaze completely now, her earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet recognition of her own part in what had unfolded. The server who had been holding the tray carefully set it down on a nearby station, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she, too, was processing something beyond the moment itself. Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against him. But more than that, the weight of understanding pressing from within. "That was not my intention," he said again, softer now, though the words felt less certain, less convincing, even to himself. Evelyn nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it, without challenging it, simply allowing it to exist as it was. "Intent does not change impact," she replied, her words landing gently but firmly, like something that had been learned long before this moment. The man beside her gave a small, approving nod, as if the sentence alone had said everything that needed to be said. And in many ways, it had. The room did not react loudly. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden applause, no raised voices. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, a subtle but undeniable change in how everyone present now saw the scene that had just unfolded. Because it was no longer about a guest being denied service. It was about something far more universal. How quickly people decide, how easily they assume, and how rarely they stop to question those assumptions before acting on them. Mark stood there, the space around him feeling different now, not hostile, not aggressive, but undeniably aware, as if the room itself had become a mirror reflecting something he had not intended to see. Evelyn took a small step forward then, not to reclaim power, not to assert dominance, but simply to continue what she had come there to do in the first place. "Now," she said calmly, her voice steady once more, "shall we check that reservation?" And in that simple question, the entire weight of the moment shifted again, not with force, but with quiet certainty, as the next step became unavoidable for everyone in the room. The question did not demand an answer. It required one, and everyone in the room could feel it as clearly as the quiet tension that still hung in the air. Mark Reynolds hesitated, not because he did not understand what needed to happen next, but because taking that next step meant acknowledging everything that had just been exposed. And for a man who had built his confidence on control, that was not a small thing. The hostess moved first, almost instinctively, as if the weight of the moment had finally tipped beyond hesitation and into action. Her fingers returned to the screen, this time without doubt, without looking for permission, typing with a steadiness that had been missing just moments before. "Carter." The reservation expanded in full detail. Private dining section, reserved under executive access. Special instructions already noted. Her breath caught slightly, not audibly, but enough to be seen in the subtle rise of her shoulders. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice softer now, carrying a respect that had not been there before. "Your table is ready." The words changed everything, not because they were loud, but because they corrected what had just happened, and everyone knew it. Mark stood still for a fraction longer, then stepped aside. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just a single step, but it was enough. Enough to shift the space he had been occupying. Enough to acknowledge, without saying it out loud, that the control he thought he held had never truly been his. Evelyn did not rush forward. She did not move immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a brief second, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with something far more grounded, something that felt almost reflective, as if she was giving him the space to fully understand the moment for what it was. Then she nodded. Once. Small. Controlled. And stepped past him. The room did not erupt into sound, but something else happened, something quieter, more powerful. People adjusted in their seats. Postures shifted. Conversations did not resume right away, because no one wanted to break what had just been witnessed. A couple near the window exchanged a glance, one that carried more meaning than words, while another guest slowly picked up his glass again, though his attention remained fixed on Evelyn as she moved through the space with calm, unhurried steps. The man beside her walked with the same measured pace, not leading, not following, but aligned, his presence no longer needing explanation, because it had already been understood. The hostess stepped out from behind the podium now, her earlier uncertainty completely replaced by a careful attentiveness, guiding them toward the private section with a quiet professionalism that felt different, more intentional, as if she were aware that this moment would stay with her long after the night ended. As they passed, a server lowered her gaze respectfully. Another offered a small nod, subtle gestures, but noticeable, and more importantly, genuine. Mark remained where he was, just for a moment longer than necessary, watching as the scene moved forward without him, the weight of what had happened settling more fully with each passing second. The security guard had already stepped back completely, returning to his position near the entrance, though his posture now carried a different awareness, one shaped by what he had just witnessed. The restaurant slowly began to breathe again, but it was not the same as before. Something had changed, not in the decor, not in the lighting, but in the way people were seeing each other. Evelyn reached the entrance to the private dining area and paused briefly, just long enough to glance back over her shoulder, not at the guests, not at the room as a whole, but at Mark. The look was not harsh. It was not accusatory. It was something else entirely, a quiet reminder. And then she turned and stepped inside, the hostess gently closing the door behind her, leaving the main dining room in a silence that no longer felt uncomfortable, but reflective, as if everyone present had just been shown something simple, yet undeniable, and could not quite return to seeing the world the same way again. Inside the private dining room, the noise of the main floor faded into a distant murmur, replaced by a calm, controlled quiet that felt entirely different from the tension outside, as if the space itself operated on a different level of understanding. The lighting was softer here, more intimate, reflecting gently off polished wood and crystal glassware arranged with precise care, every detail intentional, every element curated to serve those who were meant to be there. Evelyn Carter stepped in without hesitation, her pace unchanged, her posture as steady as it had been from the moment she entered the building, her presence now fully aligned with the space around her, as though there had never been any question of belonging. The man beside her pulled out a chair with quiet respect, not as a performance, not for show, but as something natural, something practiced, and Evelyn took her seat with the same composed grace, her hands resting lightly on the table as she glanced briefly at the place setting in front of her, then up again, her expression thoughtful but calm. "Everything is prepared as requested," the man said, his voice lower now, more private, though still carrying that same quiet authority, "including the documentation you asked for." Evelyn gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without surprise, as if this meeting, this moment, had been planned long before anyone in the main dining room had even realized she existed. Outside, however, the air had not yet settled. Mark Reynolds remained near the center of the room, though the space around him now felt different, less defined by his presence and more by the absence of certainty that had once supported it. Conversations had resumed, but not fully, not comfortably, as if the earlier scenes still lingered in the background of every word spoken. A guest near the bar leaned slightly toward his companion, speaking in a low voice that carried just enough to be noticed, while another table remained unusually quiet, their attention still drifting toward the closed door of the private dining room. The hostess returned to her position slowly, her movements careful, deliberate, her expression no longer uncertain but reflective, as though she was replaying the moment again and again, seeing it more clearly each time. Mark exhaled, running a hand briefly along the edge of his jacket as if trying to smooth something that could not be adjusted so easily. He turned toward the podium, his steps measured, his posture attempting to return to its usual form, but something had shifted, something that would not simply reset. "What exactly is the Carter reservation?" he asked quietly, his voice controlled, though no longer carrying the same effortless authority. The hostess hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering, her voice steady, respectful, but now informed by what she knew. It is listed under executive priority, she said, her eyes meeting his briefly, linked to the ownership group. The words did not rise in volume, but they did not need to. Mark felt them immediately, the meaning settling in with a clarity that made everything else fall into place at once. Ownership, not a guest, not a visitor, something far beyond what he had assumed. His gaze shifted instinctively toward the private dining room door, now closed, now quiet, yet suddenly carrying more weight than anything else in the space. Inside that room sat the person he had just tried to remove, the person he had judged in seconds, the person whose presence he had dismissed without question. And outside, in the room he believed he managed, the consequences of that decision lingered in every glance, every subtle shift in tone, every moment of silence that followed. The security guard avoided eye contact now, returning to his post with a different awareness, while a server approached the podium more carefully than before, her voice quieter, her posture more attentive, as if something fundamental had changed in how she understood her role. Mark remained still for a moment longer, the weight of realization fully settling, before he straightened slightly, not in regained confidence, but in acknowledgement, as though he understood now that this was not a moment he could undo, only one he would have to learn from. And behind the closed door, where the noise could not reach, Evelyn Carter sat calmly at the table prepared for her, reviewing a single document placed neatly before her, her expression steady, her focus clear, as if the events outside had not disrupted her purpose at all, but had simply revealed something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Inside the private dining room, the world remained steady, untouched by the quiet storm that had passed through the restaurant just moments before, and Evelyn Carter sat with the same calm presence she had carried. From the very beginning, her attention focused not on the tension she had left behind, but on the purpose that had brought her there. The document in front of her was simple in appearance, a few pages neatly aligned, but the weight of what it represented extended far beyond the table, far beyond the building itself, because decisions made in rooms like this rarely stayed contained within them. The man seated across from her watched in silence, giving her space, understanding that nothing needed to be rushed, that clarity did not require urgency. Evelyn turned a page slowly, her eyes scanning with quiet precision, before she set the document down and folded her hands lightly, her gaze thoughtful, composed, as if everything that had just happened had only confirmed something she had already known. "It is never about the uniform," she said softly, more to the moment than to the man across from her, her voice carrying the kind of clarity that came from experience rather than reaction. "It is about what people decide when they see it." Outside, the restaurant had found its rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Conversations were more measured, glances more intentional, and even the smallest interactions carried a new awareness, as if the space itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Mark Reynolds stood near the edge of the dining room, no longer at the center, no longer defining the flow of the room, but observing it, his posture still, his expression quieter, as if he were seeing the environment he had managed for years through a different lens for the first time. The hostess moved with a new attentiveness, greeting guests with a steadier presence, her tone more careful, her eyes more aware, while the servers carried themselves with a subtle shift, each interaction now shaped by something they could not quite put into words, but all of them had felt. And though no one spoke directly about what had happened, it remained there, woven into the space, a silent reference point that influenced everything that followed. Mark's gaze drifted once more to the private dining room door, closed, still, yet holding more significance than any other part of the restaurant, because behind it sat the person who had unknowingly revealed something about all of them. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through stillness, through presence, through the simple act of not becoming what they expected her to be. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not because the moment had passed, but because he understood now that it would not truly leave. Not in the way he had once understood situations to end. Some moments do not conclude. They remain. They shift perspective. They change the way decisions are made long after the room has quieted. Inside, Evelyn rose from her seat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet purpose, the meeting complete, the document left neatly aligned on the table as if it had fulfilled its role without needing explanation. The man across from her stood as well, his expression respectful, his posture aligned with hers, as they moved toward the door with the same composed rhythm they had entered with. And when that door opened again, the room noticed. Not loudly, not with interruption, but with awareness. Evelyn stepped out into the main dining area once more, the same uniform, the same quiet presence, yet now seen completely differently by every person who had witnessed what came before. No one questioned her place now. No one looked at her with uncertainty, because they were no longer seeing just what she wore. They were seeing what they had missed. And as she walked past Mark, her steps steady, her gaze forward, she did not stop, did not pause, did not demand acknowledgement, because none of that was necessary anymore. The lesson had already been delivered. And in the silence that followed her exit, the restaurant remained still for just a moment longer, as if holding onto the understanding that had settled there before life resumed, slightly altered, slightly wiser, carrying forward a truth that needed no explanation. And that night, without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture, everyone in that room remembered exactly what dignity looks like.